like to thank Max for giving us his time today. Max recently completed an MSc in Global Business and Sustainability, and during that time carried out an MSc thesis on the role of intermediary organizations in blending investments for landscape restoration. He comes with a keen interest in circularity, climate adaptation, and sustainable land use, and also has previously studied at the Erasmus University. Oh, yeah, that's where you did the MSc. and also is currently working as a consultant. So I'll let you explain a little bit more about yourself, but we're really interested to hear about the results from your study. And then what we'll do is allow Max to present for about 20 minutes, and then we'll follow that with a Q&A where it will open up to the floor for everyone. In the meantime, I might just mute you if you're not already muted. And the floor's over to you. Thank you, Max.
Thank you, Disha. Well, to start with, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Max Berkelmans. As Disha already mentioned, last year I completed a master program in Global Business and Sustainability at the Rotterdam School of Management. And at the same time, I did an internship at Commonland, I hope an organization you're all familiar with. This actually triggered me to write my thesis on blended finance and landscape restoration projects. And quite a fun fact that these are two topics or themes I actually never heard of before writing the thesis. But I find it in the process so very interesting that hopefully my future career will also do something related to these themes. So thanks again, Disha, for providing me with the floor to present my findings. I prepared some questions for after the presentation, but then I just open up the floor for like a discussion. So if you have any questions, then you can either ask me right away or leave them for the end. So today I'm going to tell you a bit more about.
Sorry, Max. Before you continue, sorry. Do you mind clicking the presentation view? Perfect.
Is it better now?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, yeah. I think I had it, but like the previous option didn't allow me to click further, but now it does. Thank you. So today I'm going to cover, first of all, to start with the need for blended finance for landscape restoration projects. Then I'm going to be very short on theory. So I borrowed the concept of intermediary organization from the literature on cross-sector partnerships. Then I'm going to discuss a little bit about my methods, the methods that I use for my thesis. And then I will dive into the results. So I will cover the most important actors that are present within landscape restoration projects, the activities that fall under landscape restoration projects, and the blending of investments. Then in the discussion, I will discuss, based on the findings from my thesis, I developed kind of a framework that outlines how investments are blended at fund and project level and the role of intermediary organizations such as project developers and fund managers in this process. Then within the conclusion, I will discuss the limitations of my research and the possible implications that the findings of my research have. So I don't think I need to explain the urgency of the problem of landscape degradation and also the funding gap that the landscape restoration sector is faced with. So I'm directly going to start on blended finance. So blended finance as a definition is an important financing mechanism or a structuring approach that combines different types of capital with different levels of risk in order to mobilize additional investments, additional market rate, return-seeking investments for impact investments. And what I noticed in the process of writing my thesis is that there's actually a lot of talk on blended finance, but not a lot of action. So if you look at the concrete transactions and activities that are out there, it's actually very limited. So if I look at a couple of initiatives that are actually being formed, such as the Land Degradation Neutrality Fund or the Agri-3 Fund, the Dutch Fund for Climate and Development, and the Africa Tree Fund that is being developed by TNC. Those are all funds and initiatives that are actually developed, they're in the process of being developed or developed quite recently. So for example, the LDN Fund made its first investment in January last year, or last year in a coffee cooperative in Peru. So to highlight that these initiatives on blended finance are actually quite recent. So that's very interested in analyzing these recent initiatives and actually going a bit deeper into the real life practicalities of blended finance instead of talking about it on a more conceptual level. So what I noticed in my thesis is that due to various barriers and such as, for example, lack of market infrastructure or the requirement of many different stakeholder groups, blended finance actually represents a small percentage of the total needs for SDG finance. And that actually brings me to an important, or like a very inspiring quote from Kamalan that I used for my thesis, is that money is not the problem, the tools exist, the science is known, and the land is available. The key critical element is stakeholder engagement. So because of the requirement of many stakeholder groups for blended finance transactions, I was very interested in this component of landscape restoration projects and blended finance. So that's also where the thesis focused on. So the main research question of my thesis was, how do stakeholders collaborate to blend investments for landscape restoration projects? And I divided this general research question into 3 parts. The first one being the actors. So which stakeholders are involved in landscape restoration projects and what are their roles? The second component is the activities. So most landscape restoration projects or programs contain various components that are either revenue generating or enabling that fall under one program or one landscape vision. So I wanted to have an overview of the various activities that can fall under landscape restoration projects and how they complement each other in terms of blending investments. Then last, I focus on the role of intermediary organizations such as project developers and fund managers. So what is the role of intermediary organizations in blending investments at both fund and project level? So a little bit of theory. I promise not to make it very long on this one. I borrowed the concept of intermediary organizations from the theory on cross-sector partnerships. And intermediary organizations are defined as organizations that span the gaps among diverse constituency to enable coordinated action. So mostly in sectors, for example, such as landscape restoration, it is very hard for different stakeholder groups to span the entire problem domain. And often stakeholders experience some barriers in order to collaborate with each other. So for example, there can be a lack of experience in working together or even a distrust. Imagine, for example, large funds and investors working together with smallholder farmers. They're not really used to work together, which can lead to problems in collaboration. The requirements of such intermediary organizations is that they should have convening power. So they should have the authority to facilitate collaboration. So for example, in my research, I analyzed a department of the UN Environment, which is a sustainable land use department, which is due to its commitment and experience in working with different organizations and expertise in the topic, has the authority to facilitate collaboration between different stakeholder groups. Furthermore, intermediaries should have an unbiased position and also have the ability to overcome the differences between partners. The different roles that intermediary organizations can have is the one, for example, of an initiator, so starting actual funds or projects on the ground. It can be convener, so bringing actually these stakeholders together to work, or the role of a mediator. So intermediaries can invest a lot of time in understanding the positions of different stakeholder groups and actually searching potential grounds for collaboration. So within my thesis, I classified project developers and fund managers as intermediary organizations for their ability to connect the global level with the local level. So from the global level, I mean the international funds that are being developed that are out there that have resources available for landscape restoration projects, but often lack the local connections and the local presence to deploy their capital and resources. The local level is the projects, the partnerships, and the communities that actually need financing for their activities, but as this they might not have the financial literacy to develop bankable projects. They actually struggle to get these types of finance. And the role of intermediaries such as project developers and fund managers actually to link these two levels and channel investments from larger international funds to the local level, so where projects are actually being developed and where the local actors are actually affected by the problem of land degradation. So that on theory. I'm going to take a little sip of water. So for my methodology, I used a qualitative and exploratory research design. So I was focusing on understanding the phenomenon of blended finance for landscape restoration instead of explaining it. And as blended finance is also quite a new research area, such an exploratory research design is quite appropriate. Then for the data collection, in total, I conducted 21 semi-structured interviews with different types of organizations, and I analyzed 19 documents as from the organizations provided me with. I also attended a teleconference and a real-life conference in Amsterdam from the Coalition for Private Investments into Conservation. So for the types of organization I analyzed different types of organizations such as project developers, NGOs, investors, companies, and even an IGO, which is the UN Environment Program. And I also analyzed several cases. So one, for example, in Kenya, in Spain, in South Africa, in Peru, in various Andean countries, Australia, and the USA. And these cases differ in terms of a degree of degradation and in terms of degree of institutionalization. And to think of, for example, I analyzed several of common lands projects, so the one in Spain and in South Africa, but I also analyzed the first investment that the Land Degradation Neutrality Fund did in Peru. So to give a bit more of an example, I think this case has already been discussed within one of these webinars, so I'm going to keep it very short. But one of the cases I analyzed was the Baviaanskloof in South Africa, which is a landscape program in which is has been developed by Living Lands and local conservation NGO, Common Land, Grounded, and they together formed the Baviaanskloof Development Company to actually transform the agricultural practices in the area from goat farming, which led to to all of the problems land degradation the area is now faced with, to the production of herbs and aromatic oils, as you can see in the pictures as well. So as I mentioned, I did 21 semi-structured interviews, and I distinguished between 4 different types of organizations. So first, the investors. So I had an interview with Rabobank, which is developing the Agri-3 Fund, together with IDH and together with the UN Environment Program. APG, a Dutch asset manager related to the pension fund. Natixis, and Mirova, which is the fund manager of the Land Degradation Neutrality Fund. Then in terms of project developers, I analyzed several types of project developers. So some can be multi-stakeholder steering groups, such as the Imarisha Naivasha project in Kenya. Some project developers are private companies, such as Ecotierra, and some are more impact foundations or international NGOs, such as Common Land. In terms of the NGOs, I analyzed several NGOs, and some of them are more operating on a global scale. Obviously, the landscape, the finance lab of the WWF, Eco Agriculture Partners, the Nature Conservancy, but I also analyzed NGOs that are a bit operating on more local scales, such as Living Lands. Last, I had interviews with several companies or cooperatives, such as, for example, Almendraesa, which is a company in the south of Spain, which processes and markets the almonds that are produced in the area in which the project is active. So that in terms of the methodology. So now I'm going to dive into the results. And I noticed it's a very big overview. And I'm going to discuss the different stakeholder groups that are part of landscape restoration projects. And I distinguish between 4 groups. So first, I distinguish between the stakeholder group project developers. So these can be private companies, as I mentioned before, NGOs, microfinance institutions, or multi-stakeholder steering groups. And their importance has been stressed by various people, various persons I had interviews with. And they can be seen as an intermediary organization because they really combine the landscape approach with their expertise within the supply chain and with their ability to work with investors. So because of their expertise on these 2 levels, they have the abilities to start projects on the ground where land degradation actually affects the local actors. But as they also have experience in engaging and reporting with investors, they're able to link what happens within the landscape actually to the language and the world of international investors and international funds and NGOs. Their role within landscape restoration projects is that they design, develop, and operate the main aspects of the landscape restoration project. And they make sure that all the elements within the landscape program contribute to the common landscape vision, which is actually also one of their main roles within landscape restoration project. And they're also responsible for raising donations and investments for the different types of actors within the landscape and the different types of activities that fall under the landscape program. The second group of stakeholders I distinguish between is the local actors. And the importance of the presence of local actors has also been stressed throughout. So these are the actors that are actually
Max, your sound is, we've just lost your sound. If you...
Hello?
Yeah, back now.
Okay. So to actually start projects on the ground within landscape restoration projects, it's very vital to have this local presence. So have the trusted relationship with the communities and smallholder farmers, as smallholder farmers actually, in the cases I analyzed, often own the majority of the land. So they're receiving their trust in that the landscape program is actually beneficial to them, both economically and ecologically for the landscape, is very vital. The first group of local actors are the restoration NGOs. So these are the NGOs that actually coordinate and carry out the main restoration works projects within the landscape. So they have an expertise on the landscape and how actually agriculture contributes or is part of the landscape. And they raise donations, and they use these different types of donations to fund their activities, such as tree planting, seed production, and constructing biodiversity corridors, for example. Then the cooperatives. The cooperatives are very key in organizing smallholder farmers. So they allow a project to work with several smallholder farmers, and also at the same time, they offer a mechanism for representing the interests of the different smallholder farmers. They can also support the transition of smallholder farmers. So for example, within a project from Commonland I analyzed in the south of Spain, they organized advice sessions for farmers so that they actually can visit the farm and identify opportunities to transform to more regenerative agricultural practices. And for example, they also organize agro coffees in which more experienced farmers can talk with farmers that are interested in the approach. Then the smallholder farmers, they bring in their land and their expertise, and they often have to change to agricultural practices that are very different from what they're used to. Such as the example in South Africa, where they transformed from goat farming to the production of herbs. Oftentimes, these changes in the transitions require a lot of investments, for which they need additional investments. The local businesses is the next stakeholder group. They can finance the transition costs that the farmers have to make, and they're also the party that are present in the landscape to process and sell the commodities or the products that are produced within the landscape, and sell these to international markets or local markets. For example, the Almendraes company I mentioned before. Then the business development entities, I think Grounded is a very good example of this, that they identify business plans that correspond to the landscape and are also economically viable. So then they can also be involved in the foundation of new organizations, and then, for example, also stay involved in providing them business support in terms of legal, HR, or marketing. The next group of stakeholders are the actors that surround the landscape, and perhaps this term might sound a bit vague, but I chose this term because I think these are the group of actors that are dependent on what happens within the landscape, or they are impacted on what happens in the landscape, for example, because they have operations there, but they have a less crucial role within the landscape restoration project, or they might have operations outside of the landscape as well. And I think the main example here is the companies or corporates that source their natural resources within the landscape program, and to cover or to mitigate reputational and operational risks, they can provide donations to the project to actually get projects running. So for example, in the Imarisha Nevasha project, for supermarket chains from the UK, such as Sainsbury's and Marks and Spencer, they provided a lot of seed funding for the initiatives there to start community projects, and also to start to develop the management plan, because they experienced risk in terms of I think the lake.
Sorry, Matt, you've gone again. Your sound is, can't hear you again.
Can you hear me again?
Okay, great. Oh, sorry. Seems like it's just me.
Oh, okay. Then I will just continue talking. So these types of companies or corporates are the main actors surrounding the landscape, and then there's also research institutions and the local government. I see some people chatting. Okay. I'll just continue that in that case. So the next group of stakeholders are the investors, and there's actually a wide range of investors that can be involved in landscape restoration projects. They differ in terms of mandates, in terms of the social and environmental goals they pursue, their fiduciary duty, or the asset classes and sizes of investments they invest in. And I think the most important distinction to make here is whether investors are like finance first investments or impact first investors. So the finance first investments that I analyzed within my thesis would be banks such as the Rabobank and pension funds such as APG. Then there are the group of more hybrid investors such as development financial institutions and impact investors. And then there's the impact first investments such as foundations, government, and public funds. These types of investors can invest directly into a landscape restoration project by, for example, providing grants to a project developer or a local actor within the landscape restoration project, or they can invest their capital and channel their donations to a blended finance fund. And these blended finance funds are often managed by a fund manager who manages the investment facility of a blended finance fund. And the technical assistance facility, which is often part of a blended finance fund, is often managed by an NGO, such as, for example, IDH or the Nature Conservancy. So that about actors. Then I'm going to continue towards the activities within landscape restoration projects. And now I can't click anymore. That's weird. Yeah, so the activities. I distinguish between 4 different types of activities that fall under landscape restoration projects. And some of these activities, such as number 4, are a group of activities that are, because of their ability to produce revenue or income streams, and the other ones are more enabling. So the first group of activities are restoration activities. So for example, the soil and water management, vegetation works, fencing. And as I mentioned before, these type of activities are all coordinated and managed by a project developer or an NGO. And they're financed by mostly donations. Then the business development activities. So as I mentioned before, for example, identifying new agricultural practices that can help to contribute to the restoration of the landscape, development of new organizations such as cooperatives or businesses, and also the support. So staying on board of the local businesses and corporations and providing them support. And there's a group of activities that contribute to creating an enabling environment for landscape restoration projects. And the most important activity here is, for example, building a common vision. So this, a project developer can, for example, design, develop, and operate the key aspects of a project, and develop a common landscape vision, which is supported by a lot of stakeholder groups in the area. This often includes the identification of the area and the actions that are part of the landscape vision, and the different stakeholder groups that are involved. And such common landscape visions are very important because they're able to combine various initiatives and address various stakeholder interests, and also manages the trade-offs that are present between different land uses and stakeholder interests. Then the stakeholder engagement is also very vital for creating an enabling environment. So for stakeholder engagement are activities in which project developers or other entities engage with the key players in the landscape, such as smallholder farmers, and gaining their trust and that the landscape restoration project is actually contributing to their own situation is very important. So, for example, a lot of activity should be done in drafting these common visions, and also to reach out to new farmers. So this can be done, for example, with the example of the agro copies I mentioned before. So to convince farmers that the landscape program is actually contributing to them. Then last, capacity building. So for example, workshops and trainings, which enables a strong governance of the institutions within the landscape restoration project. For example, the management of the finances of cooperatives. Then the last category is the activities that actually contribute to, can generate revenue or income streams. And the most important The most important part of type of activities here, the processing and the sales of products. So mostly local businesses or project developers are the ones that buy products from farmers, process them, and process and market and sell commodities or raw materials to clients. This is, for example, an example of the LDN fund, Land Degradation Neutrality Fund. They mentioned that they apply actually the same techniques as they did in the renewable energy space, is that they only invest in the production actors. And the sales of the commodities and raw materials actually enables these actors to generate financial returns, which then makes them attractive to invest in from the side of the LDN fund. A second group of activities that can generate revenue streams are the microcredit. So project developer or micro financial institutions, they lend money to cooperatives that are active in the landscape restoration project. And these in turn lend microcredits to producers and farmers. And when farmers pay back these microcredits with a form of interest, this can actually lead to revenue streams. The third group of revenue generating activities are the carbon credits. So carbon credits can actually be the overarching driver of a landscape restoration project, or the incomes that are generated from carbon credits can be used to support or finance other types of activities within the landscape restoration project. They can be developed by the project developer itself or by other specialized international carbon project developers, which then sell the carbon credits to international markets. Last group is the land and farm acquisition. So I think the example of white open agriculture in Western Australia is a good example, is that they acquire land or farms and then they transform the farm according to regenerative agricultural practices. And then they can sell the farms again when the land is restored or transformed. And in this way, they also have a bridging function between farmers and investors, because they search for farms that are for sale, and then they package the deals to investors. So then in terms of the activities of landscape restoration projects. Now I'm going to continue to two frameworks I developed, which is blend how the role of intermediaries at actually fund level and project level. And within these models, I distinguish between antecedents, so the critical success factors that are necessary for successful blending, the process, so how the intermediary organization actually, how they actually blend investments, and the outcomes of these processes. And the intermediary fund level, as I mentioned before, is here the fund manager. And it can also, I also analyze the role of the department from the UN Environment on sustainable land use, which can also be categorized as an intermediary organization. But I will focus here on the role of fund managers. In terms of critical success factors, blending at fund level requires an experienced funds manager that bridges project developers and investors. So these fund managers should have experience in dealing with investors and project developers. And by designing and developing funds, they actually enable investors that are unexperienced or unaware of investing in certain regions or sectors. They enable these investors to invest in these sectors. For example, landscape restoration project, which is not a very familiar area to invest in for a lot of investors. By designing funds, fund managers can bridge this gap. Then another thing that is necessary is that in blending investments require the presence of investors with different types of mandate and risk return preferences. So some investors should also have these social and environmental criteria to finance the enabling activities within landscape restoration projects. And also these types of investments are often used to de-risk the transactions for the private investors. Last, the critical success factor for blending at fund level is also structured blended finance fund and a certain know-how on blending. So it's actually very useful for example, public investors to have a certain know-how on what are appropriate standards for blending, because some don't want to subsidize or support the private sector too much. So by structuring funds, fund managers can actually set appropriate standards for blending based on market practices. So that in terms of the critical success factors. Then in the process of blending investment, fund managers are responsible for raising both donations and investors, which they use to de-risk investments on fund level. So by designing funds, they can bring investors together, pool their resources, and aggregate investment opportunities, which leads to important risk sharing and diversifications for private investment. It also leads to economies of scale and reduce transaction costs. And specifically within blended finance funds, the capital is provided by philanthropic and public investors can be used to lower the risk for private sector investment within transactions. So for example, by providing first loss agreements or loan guarantees. And this enables fund managers to provide private investors with deals that have a more attractive risk return ratio. Fund managers also use the donations that they raise to fund the technical assistance facility of blended finance fund. So the technical assistance facility is often managed by an NGO, complements the activity by, for example, providing grants and technical assistance to promising projects and partnerships. This enables projects that might be promising, but they're not at this stage able to absorb larger volumes of private investment. For example, the money from the investments from the technical assistance facility can go to the monitoring of social and environmental impact, capacity building, feasibility studies. So that enables these projects to attract larger scale investments on a later stage. A last thing that a fund manager does in the process of blending investment is that they align the different requirements of investors. So philanthropic, public and private investment might have different requirements and also different interests. So for example, some investors might have a focus on biodiversity while others find carbon capture more important, or gender. And by presenting an integrated picture to these different types of investors, a fund manager can actually bridge their perspectives and make sure that different types of investments are pooled within the same fund. Then in terms of outcomes, the donations and investment as raised by the fund manager are used or channeled to project developers by which the project developers can finance their own operation or fund the different activities in the landscape. So these different types of investments are actually enable a project developer to both finance the revenue generating activities within the landscape and also the enabling aspects. Then the activities of the technical assistance facility lead to a pipeline of bankable projects. So they lead to an improved readiness level of certain promising projects and partnerships, which can actually contribute to a major bottleneck that I read all the times in various articles of a lack of bankable projects. The technical assistance facility can also lead to risk mitigation. So by capacity building, supporting implementation on the ground in which for investments that the investment facility of the blended finance fund already invested in can reduce risks for private investors because they increase the opportunities for a successful project. The activities of the technical assistance facility fund, they also ensure that social and environmental returns are maximized rather than compromised. For example, by supporting the implementation on the ground or doing the monitoring of social and environmental returns. And last, increased activities and transaction can lead to a track record, which can in turn lead to increased familiarization in investing in blended finance funds and landscape restoration projects by investors. Sorry, Disha, I notice I'm a bit over time. I'm trying to hurry as much as possible. I think I need another 3 minutes to discuss the blending and on a project level. Is that fine, or should I go directly?
Please go ahead, yeah.
Okay. So in terms of blending at project level, the most important intermediary here is the project developer. And in terms of critical success factors, a champion project developer is actually required that bridges the gaps that exist between investors and local actors on the ground. So they can link the international funds that have the resources but lack the local connections to implement projects with local communities that sometimes lack the financial literacy to develop bankable projects. They're also another critical success factor is the mentioned common landscape vision that includes several enabling and revenue generating activities. And it's also supported by various stakeholder groups that are present within the landscape. To develop such a local vision, a local presence is also very necessary. So relationship with local actors and also receiving their trust that the landscape restoration project is beneficial to them. A critical success factor for blending at project level is also a certain type of organization of smallholder farmers. For example, so it's oftentimes is not very viable for investors to deal with a large amount of smallholder farmers due to a large transaction. So a way of project to scale is to actually work with cooperatives that enable project developers to work with a lot of smallholder farmers at the same time without having a lot of transaction costs. The certain institutionalization of smallholder farmers is also in the form of the presence of local businesses. So there need to be an actor that can actually enable farmers to sell their products to, and there's also experience in processing and marketing these products to international or local markets. Last, different types of investments are necessary to finance the different aspects of the landscape restoration project. So within the process of blending, the project developer raises both donations and investments to channel these different types of subsequently channel these different types of investments to the various actors and activities within the landscape. They, for example, can support local actors in the landscape by providing them soft loans or becoming shareholders within these organizations, or they can even found completely new organizations, such as has been the case within one of Commonland's project in the south of Spain, in which cooperatives and the local business was co-developed together with the local farmers and NGOs. Next, project developer in the process is key in aggregating smallholder farmers and investment opportunities. So again, by working with cooperatives, it allows the projects to work with a lot of smallholder farmers and ensure also that their interests are represented. The last thing in the process of blending at project level is that that stakeholders within the landscape can actually work together to have a more compelling stories towards investors. So every time by, for example, presenting them as a consortium of different partners, they have a stronger story, which enables them to have better opportunities for attracting funds and donations. They, for example, can stress the synergies and spillover effects that working together on the landscape scale can have, which makes for a more attractive investment opportunity. Then last, the outcomes on blending at project level is that the activities of the project developer and actors within the landscape can lead to investments for the various actors and activities that are present within the landscape, which in turn leads to various financial, social, and environmental returns. Working with a lot of smallholder farmers leads to an increased scale for the project, which actually makes, for some investors that have certain preferred investment sizes, makes it attractive to finance certain projects in which have a larger scale. And then last, the working together on a landscape scale can lead to increased efficiency of funding, and also to positive spillover effects when people are actually working together on similar issues. That in terms of blending at project level. So very short, the conclusions. Landscape restoration project requires several stakeholders from various societal spheres, each having their specific role within the project. It requires also different activities to ensure revenue streams, but also to ensure social and environmental returns. And the level at which blending takes place has an influence on the type of organization that are involved and the role of an intermediary organization in the process. I think a major limitation of my research could be that I analyze different cases, that actually are quite different in nature. So some initiatives only made use out of public investments, while others were only financed by private investment. So I think the type of investments that were attracted has quite an influence on the way blending takes place, and also the types of organizations that are involved. Furthermore, working on the landscape scale is actually the term landscape is actually something some people I interviewed actually struggled a bit with, is that they weren't familiar what it actually entailed. So I think also the cases that I analyzed had different understandings of what it actually is to work on the landscape scale. In terms of managerial implications, I hope that my research has contributed to actually show that the market for blended finance and landscape restoration are actually at an early stage of development. And the findings of my thesis might lead to increased familiarization from investors in the landscape restoration sector, and perhaps also from the side of local projects and partnerships, increase understanding of the financing opportunities for landscape restoration project. And perhaps because via my thesis, I might have also clarified the concept of working on the landscape skill a bit. Well, that was it from my side. Thank you very much for your attention. And as mentioned before, like I drafted some questions, but if you have any other questions, just please do not hesitate to ask. And yeah, I'm looking forward to a fruitful discussion here. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Max. I see that Stuart's unmuted himself, and so maybe has some questions. Yeah. No,
yeah, I do. If at all possible, that would be great. Thank you very much. And Max, thank you very much for running through your presentation and obviously sharing your research. You mentioned philanthropic and donations can help reduce obviously the upfront investment costs to improve returns. Did you get any sort of sense or an indication what is perceived to be an acceptable level of return with blended finance options?
I think that differs a bit on depends a bit on the context. One of the cases I analyzed mentioned that impact investors in, for example, Australia actually still even required a return on investment of 10 to 15%. And if I remember correctly, in a fund that the TNC is developing called, for example, in the time I analyzed it, it was called the Africa Tree Fund. They were targeting, I think, investments that had a return on investment from 4 to 6%. So I think it depends on the initiatives that you analyze.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. And from your perception, where do you think the market may go in being able to accept lower rates of return for a greater social impact? Did you sort of get any sense of a changing in market context?
That's a good one. I think, yeah, it actually depends on the type of investors you're talking to. I think like these finance first investors, they're still quite hesitant, or they might be incentivized to put more of their finances or investments into landscape restoration projects. But the whole in the Baviaanskloof in South Africa, I think they're still in the phase of it's very hard to attract more these asset investments as as it is called in this figure, and the enabling investments they attracted so far indeed mostly on developing new organizations or doing the landscape restoration projects. And perhaps like within the future, if the Baviaanskloof Development Company is developed or skilled, then it might be possible to attract more of these asset investments. But it's indeed like a kind of a theoretical concept. And before, I obviously read a lot of literature and encountered this model. But then if you talk to projects on the ground, they say like, okay, obviously, indeed, we're now then more in the enabling investment phase, but they wouldn't talk about their project in this sense that it's so like separated. At first you have this enabling investment phase, and then I think in practice what I wanted to say, it's a bit more fluent, but I think you can definitely see such kind of a phasing.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
You're welcome. It's nice to see you again.
And this is Steve Francis. I had found the actor diagram very interesting, not both the delineation of the actors and the kind of the relationship lines and so forth. Is this something that you came across? There's no source labeled here, or did you find similar things and were able to synthesize them to build this diagram, or did this come entirely from your interview process?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for your question. It's actually the last point you made. So what I actually forgot to mention is that obviously I tried to draft like a more general overview of how actors can collaborate within landscape restoration projects. So certain relationships that you will find here are not obviously are not present in every landscape restoration I analyzed. And also there might even be some relationships that are out there that were quite hard to put like in one general model. So I think, for example, a separate entity that I distinguish between within my thesis is the business development entities, and for example, Grounded, that is active in South Africa or Sub-Saharan Africa, is a very good example of this. But I, for example, haven't found another organization that does similar type of work. And what is perhaps interesting to mention as well is that the investment in which the Land Degradation Neutrality Fund makes its first investment is a fund that is managed by Ecotierra, which is a fund manager and actually a project developer at the same time. So they are a project developer, but they also develop their own fund, which is the Urapi fund. So that's also actually like even the person I interviewed from Ecotierra mentioned, like, if you find any similar act or any similar initiative that is out there, then please inform me, because we haven't done so far. So that's also, for example, something I couldn't really cover within this diagram.
That makes sense. You probably don't know, but working with Disha on this 1,000 Landscapes for a Billion People project, I too am in the process of interviewing, and our team is in the process of interviewing various actors in these landscapes. Is it possible, are your interview notes in a form that it might be possible to review those notes?
Yeah, definitely. I think I conducted most of all of the interviews in English, even the ones I had with the Dutch person. So yeah, I can definitely, if you're interested, I can definitely send them to you.
Great. I'll follow up with Disha. Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Apologies, I got cut off for a second. So I saw that there's also one more question from Romain around suggestions on who the best steerer for the proposed landscape approach might be.
Is that the direct question, or are we now waiting for? Should I answer it right away, or in that case, can you please repeat it, or is somebody now gonna ask the actual question?
Oh, I see. It's in the chat box, actually. Sorry, but Romain, please feel free to unmute yourself in case you want to elaborate further.
Let me search for the chat box then.
Disha, maybe you should unmute Romain if Romain does not know how to do that.
Yeah, let me try that.
Yeah, no, actually I had a problem with my laptop. It's not a matter of not knowing, but can you hear me?
I hear
yes,
you.
we can hear you.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. So maybe it's a silly question, but as thinking that's in a lot of places of who should be the right person to try to bring that approach, common vision on a landscape. Who is this right person, and what kind of entity? I was just wondering, because you listed a lot of stakeholders, with everybody having a clear role, but who is really driving the vehicle? And to get the support from the finance side, and to have also authority on the other stakeholders, who is usually perceived as the most reliable kind of stakeholder or convener in this kind of approach, you would say, at least from your example?
Yeah. Yeah, it's actually a very, very good question. I think it differs very much between different projects. And I think within the scope of my thesis, I made project developers as having this role. But then even in the projects in which Common Land is involved, I find it a very good contrast is that in the project they started in Spain, there was apparently quite a big distrust between business activities. So they really started from, with a lot of stakeholder engagement and co-developing cooperatives and a local business within the landscape. So a lot of focusing on the stakeholder side of things. While in the project they had in Western Australia, in which they worked together with White Open Agriculture, there was also already a lot of activities going on in terms of NGOs or so the approaching within Western Australia was more on like the business side of things. So I think, the type of actor that has has the convening power to do this depends on the landscape. But what might actually work is that by, for example, providing a certain methodology or model, such as the 4 returns framework of the 3 zones 4 returns framework of common land, that might actually lead to like an increased legitimacy, and that they're perceived by the local actors in the landscape as a trusted partner. But either way, like a project developer can have this role, but I think really tying it to the local actors and the local having a local presence is very vital in this sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. Sure.
Great. Are there any other further questions for Max?
I think, I'm sorry, a closing question. What do you think, Max, is holding us back? Or what should we tackle to sort of keep moving on this?
Good question. I think actually, and that might be an interesting angle from my thesis, is that I do see, or I did see a lot of different initiatives going on, and perhaps the most important aspect lacking is like indeed the lack of awareness or infrastructure to actually connect different different types of funds and also organizations. So indeed, like what I mentioned before, is that there might be funds out there that are wishing to deploy capital in certain areas, such as landscape restoration projects, but they don't really have the local presence. And indeed, the projects that are active and which are actually very relevant in terms of the restoration of landscapes, they might struggle to find their finances because they are not perhaps the best actors to develop bankable projects, and are struggle to actually link with these more international funds and investors. So in that sense, I think having these type of actors that can bridge the local and global levels are very vital. And in that way, project developers and fund managers can actually be a very big changing agents within this sector. So I would say keep up the good work from Common Land, but maybe the advice is a bit general. I think that the development of these funds is something I see good value in. Does that answer your question a bit, or is it?
No, definitely. I think it's I think for people in this industry, it can be a bit frustrating to see this sort of, there's so much potential. There's so much, like, there's funding. There's so many beautiful initiatives on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
How are we not able to connect the dots? And I think we're all trying to.
Mm-hmm.
But I agree with you with what you just said, keep going. Yeah.
I think, but then I'm less aware of what the Landscape Finance Lab does, like into detail. But I think this is also a very good approach, like supporting promising landscape and partnerships in order for them to mobilize, like to be able to attract these larger pools of finance. It's also actually very much what corresponds to having this intermediary role. So yeah, I think these initiatives are all quite like recent, right? So if we indeed continue our good work here, then I think it will look very different within a couple of years.
Let's hope so. Yeah.
Yeah.
And in a similar follow-on, perhaps we're starting to develop theories that if we can help landscapes speak in a common language or present in a common framework or those sorts of things, that commonality can help bridge the gap. Does that seem reasonable in the context of your own findings?
I think so indeed, because that's a very good point. It's something I heard several times, that people don't actually have a clue what it means to work on a landscape scale, and even the partners that have a certain definition, obviously this differs. I think I attended a conference in Amsterdam. I think it was the Amsterdam International Water Conference, in which the WWF, but it was persons from Holland or from the Netherlands, presented their view on what is working on a landscape scale. And then obviously Common Land has its 3-zone approach, which is their own definitions on what it means to be working on a landscape scale. So a lot of people don't actually know what it is. And then some actors do have a definition of it, but it obviously might have common elements. But then it might also differ. So indeed, having like a common definition would perhaps work. So perhaps isn't that something you're also developing within 1,000 landscape initiatives, or is that not part of your work?
Yes, I would say that it, unfortunately, the potential definition of the work within 1,000 landscapes is almost infinite, but it certainly is one of the emergent themes. I would say that such standardization might be helpful.
Yeah, I think that's also, you probably are aware of it, but there was a working group within CPIC that's actually focusing on this specifically. So I think Seth James of Eco Agriculture Partners was developing a paper on this, which I think will be published soon, but that might also help in this sense.
Very good, thank you.
Brilliant. I'm just noticing that we're coming to the end of the hour, and so I'd like to really say thank you, Max, for sharing this work, and we'd love to follow up further with any discussion that is also coming out of this. So we've got a recording which we'll share on the lab platform, and also we can share on the For Return site as well, and within the WWF world as well. So it would be great if we can share any questions coming back to you, and maybe continue this discussion virtually as well.
Obviously, yeah, sounds very interesting.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for joining. I'll share the video and the notes shortly.